Good morning. How you guys doing this morning? Good? Well, good. My name's Matt. I'm the pastor here. We're so glad you're with us this morning, those who are watching online and gathering in Denver as well today. We just want two quick updates before we kind of dive in to the series that we're in. Very quickly, in our children's area, we have something called Victory Lane. It's a big wall painted with kind of a road through the long wall there in Kid Street. And Heather wanted me, tell you that we already started putting some stories up. The goal for Victory Lane is to share some things that are going on in family ministry, some of the highlights, some of the things they're seeing with our kids, and she kind of wants you guys to know about it and that you can contribute as well. We started with some of the Post-it notes that are stuck on the wall from her, kind of a get to know Heather a little bit better a couple weeks ago, and she has a few more stories she's working on to get posted. Matter of fact, a really cool update a couple weeks ago that we found out from Heather is that they kind of a concentrated time in one of their large group times, just talking about salvation and an understanding of what that looks like, and seven kids asked Christ to come in their hearts. So that's awesome. We're really excited about that, and they're going to have more of those stories up on that, and they want you to make sure you go see it as you kind of, rushing to get your kids or take them in. Just take a moment to kind of look at some of those stories that are there, and then also you can Post-it notes are there so you can contribute as well. Second thing I want to make sure you are aware of is we were having some, how many of you remember back at Christmas time when we raised some funds, some of the funds we were raising at the end of the year was going to go to ASP flood relief in West Virginia. How many of you guys remember that? Only you guys can remember that? Okay, good. All right, well, let me fill you in. We raised some funds at the end of the year to send to ASP, one of our global outreach partners, to give for flood relief very specifically. So we've been asking and trying to find out where to send the money that we raised. You guys crushed our goal, so we were going to add more money to it and send it to them. We were asking to find out where it was. We also, global outreach also had some money that we raised throughout the year. So we kind of had a pretty good sized check to send. And through Mike and Kelly asking about it this past week, we were kind of just like, we're just going to send the check because nobody can get back to us on what we're supposed to do. And they ended up telling us that there's somebody who basically is going to match all the donations right now. They were going to match the donations that were being given up to $100,000. And so we're going to send that because that means basically our $15,000 plus $3,000, our $18,000 is now going to become $32,000 to go towards flood relief. Isn't that cool? I'm really excited about that, having a really big impact in what we're able to help do. So thank you guys again for your generosity in that. As always, you can ask questions. We always tell you can text them in or email us during the series if you need to. We're doing an Old Testament kind of conversation right now, and so they tend to raise a lot of questions. So hopefully you'll have some questions today, and we always try to answer those at the end of the second service. We put them on our YouTube channel online. So just want to make sure you guys were aware of that. As we continue the series called "Follow the Leader." All right, it's a study in a time. It's a book and a time frame of Judges. Our focus right now in the series is really the first word. What's the first word? Follow. This is going to be an interactive morning, so I'm going to have you do it one more time. What's the first word? Follow, right. That's really the idea, because if you are a leader, it doesn't really matter whether you're a leader or follower, where you consider yourselves. We are all actually followers. And even though we're studying this time of Judges and looking at leaders that God raised up, there's so many things in there that we can learn, not just from leadership, but understanding the idea of fellowship. And that's a real word. I looked it up because my wife gets mad when I make up words. But fellowship is a real word. It's these rules of leadership and fellowship. And so for all of us, we've kind of just taken this journey together. Now, the verse that we've been kind of reading every week, just to help wrap our minds about the leadership and following, is this from Paul. It's in 1 Corinthians 11. And I want us to read it together. I'm trying to get it burned into our memory. All right, so let's read this together. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Paul was really emphasizing that it doesn't matter who you're choosing to follow, but just make sure that they are also following. So he says, hey, you can follow my example. That's fine as long as I am following the example of Christ. And I love the fact that Paul kind of put this verse in there. It leads me down a golden rule of leadership that hopefully you know this by now. But this rule that, listen, the best followers really are also good leaders. Is that my next slide? The best leaders are actually good followers. And if you ever have somebody that says, well, I'm really a better leader than I am follower, you just don't need to follow them, okay? Because that means they don't understand some of the principles of being a good follower. We like our leaders to be set apart. We like our leaders to maybe be a little bit separate from us. We don't want to be considering co-following with them. But the reality is that that's really important. As a matter of fact, No matter who you choose to follow in terms of some of your spiritual leaders in your life, you need to be really sure about some of the, I call them the pedestals you put people up on, because they really should be focused on following just as much as you are. They're a joint follower far more than they are a leader spiritually in your life. And people call me Pastor Matt sometimes, and I don't mind people calling me Pastor Matt, but I have conversations with the people, I can tell they're trying to put me up on a pedestal, and my job in that moment is to kick that pedestal down. I cuss on purpose, and I just, I do stuff just to help them understand. I am just like you. We are both followers of God. I just happen to be in a place where he's called me to do some leading. But, my interest is just like yours in terms of continuing to stay close, to see what it looks like to follow and to continue to be a follower of God regardless of me leading. And so we want to continue to go through Judges as we learn all these principles. Judges, when I say judges, just think in your mind, champions, warriors, leaders. When it says God raised up a judge, that's really kind of just the description of these people he raised up. There were 15 judges over a time frame of 365 years, which is a really long time. We have no other reference for that in our current history in terms of something that long over a period of time. And this is from the historical books in the Old Testament. Let me just remind everybody that the historical books in the Old Testament are given to us for history. They're given to us not to tell us what should have happened. They're given to us to tell us what did happen. Does that make sense? All right, that's why we get the historical books in the Old Testament. They're telling us what did happen, and we can learn from that, but it's not always written what should have happened. It's definitely the case with Judges. There's a few judges that I love. Deborah is one of my favorite judges. Her story is really unique, and again, if you're parents and you're not reading Judges to your children, you're missing some of the greatest content in the world, right? Deborah is a fantastic judge. She's actually a prophet as well. She reigned with wisdom during her time in rule for 40 years. She's known for raising up a leader to raise an army to go take care of this other kingdom. And that leader basically was a little bit of a scaredy cat. He wanted Deborah to follow him and be with him when he led this army. And she basically said, okay, now you're mixing it up because really God's the one you're following, and told the guy, hey, you're not going to get victory for this. A woman's going to get victory for this. And Deborah wasn't talking about her. Deborah was actually talking about this other girl named Jael who would be a nobody that nobody would know about, and she ends up being the one who takes out the king. I'm just not going to tell you what happened, but there's a tent peg involved, and it's awesome. All right, so you need to be reading these stories, all right? There's Jephthah, which is another judge. He also was incredible in terms of leader. His father was famous in the tribes. His mother was a prostitute, so because of that, he was cast out. He was rejected, but God raised him up as a leader. God raised him up as a judge, and he did some phenomenal things, but he was also foolish. He also made a stupid vow to God that he didn't need to make, and ended up losing his one and only kid because of a vow that he made. And so we notice in terms of this, and I want to just go back to last week. There's a very big principle when we look at these leaders and followers. Especially last week we looked at Samson, and here's the principle we focused on last week: the followers are flawed and failed and broken, which means that leaders are flawed and failed and broken. That you're going to see this. And Samson, sadly, we are given the history of Samson as being a judge, but he's marked. His whole story is just marked by his failures and his flaws and his brokenness, but God was still able to use him. God was still able to use all of those things and leverage them for the benefit of God's people. They're all remembered in Hebrews in terms of the hall of faith, we call it. Hebrews 11. Later on it says, how much more do I need to say this? He's already talked about several stories and examples. He says, I would take too long to recount the stories of faith of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and all the prophets. He said, there's so many here that God used. And names off several of these judges that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. Today I'm focusing in on a guy named Gideon. Now Gideon's the fifth judge. And what you notice in terms of the time of judges is that you'll see it again with Gideon, is that God's people sort of follow a judge and follow God for a period of time, and then they go back to kind of their drift. They drift back to their natural ways in terms of just paganism and things, and they follow other gods, and then they go through massive distress and massive oppression, and then they cry out to God for help, and then God raises up another judge and helps them out. And this is 365 years, up and down, up and down, up and down. And you see this again, especially in terms of where the people of God were in Gideon's time. Gideon would reign and have rule for 40 years. as a judge and would bring peace for 40 years. You can find his whole story in Judges 6 through 8. Now, we have Bibles at the back. If you don't have a Bible, you can take it home to read it. I'm going to tell you this up front because we're not reading all of Gideon's story. As a matter of fact, I'm purposely going to stop at a cliffhanger and not tell you how something really ends up. You're going to have to go read it on your own and catch the last little bit of Gideon's story. I want you guys to be reading your Bible. We're going to look at the first really half of Gideon's life and learn some principles that I think are just highly needed in our culture today. And here's the reason why. As we look at Gideon, here's his story. He's a leader and follower's life of faith, life of fear and faith. This is a story of someone just like you and me, who's a follower, who becomes a leader, and his life is filled with fear and faith. And it's a big deal for me. This is one of those areas that I talk about a lot, the tension that lives between fear and faith and life and faith. And I want all of us, and this is just me personally, I do not want my life marked by fear. How many of you guys we're just going to make this a little interactive. How many would you say, you would be honest and say, that in your past, in your life, you have felt in your past that you were really kind of consumed with and motivated by fear, stress, worry, and anxiety? Just be honest and raise your hand. All right? All right, now how many of you would be super honest? Yeah, how many of you would be super honest and say, that wasn't just my past life. I currently feel like I have a life filled with fear, stress, anxiety, and worry. Just raise your hand. That's good. Well, today we're going to talk specifically about that, especially some of the lessons we can learn from this judge named Gideon. So we'll jump into Judges 6. As we look at his story, we're going to start in kind of the background of his story. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. This is Judges 6:1. So the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. And the Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains and caves and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, marauders from the Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the lands and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all their sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hordes, coming with their livestock and tents, were as thick as locusts. They arrived in droves of camels, too numerous to count, and they stayed in the land until it was stripped bare. So Israelite was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then the Israelites would cried out to the Lord for help. Again, just very common in their thing. But one thing we pull out from Gideon's story right away is just another principle in his life in terms of this, is that oftentimes, right, God uses tough times to get our attention. You know, he uses these tough times, he uses these times of distress to kind of bring us back maybe to a place of focus and a place to get our attention. Now, I want us to be very careful when we look at this, because not every horrible thing that happens to you is because God wants to get your attention. All right, yeah, that doesn't fall in line with the character of God. It doesn't fall in line with how sin works. And sometimes people on the margins of Christianity have this kind of like very little skin in the game kind of insults of, well, all the things that, why doesn't God take care of this, and why doesn't God do that, and why would he let this happen? And the reality is that they don't understand the character of God. They do not understand how sin functions and works in this world. And so the reality is, if that's you, please, meet our staff. We'll take you to lunch. We'll have a much longer conversation about that. But the reality is that when we fall prey to that thinking, then we look at a story like Job, and we just assume that everything that goes wrong is God having some sort of cosmic chess match, and we're just the pawns, in his game. And that's not at all in terms of what this is saying. But I do want us to take an understanding that in their history, the Israelites would oftentimes go through this distress, and they would cry out to God, and he would leverage what was happening. He would use the negative circumstances in their life to try to bring them back to himself. I love C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist, who tried to disprove the claims of Christ and actually became a Christian himself. I love this quote by him. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, and he speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. That sometimes it takes a fracture, and sometimes it takes something drastic to get our attention, to kill the noise, to create a pause long enough for us to give him the attention that he's asking for. And in this moment, again, just from the history of God's people, we see that this also is one of the things that God's going to use to get their attention. So they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge. The angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Ophrah. This is not Oprah, but it's Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a wine press. And the wine press would have been a very deep cut area in a field, very deep area where they would have done a lot of the wine work, so you couldn't be seen. It was to hide the grain from the Midianites. This is a place of fear. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" How many have ever said that at all, ever out loud to God or in your mind? Okay, this is another one of those things that we just see. God always sees more than we do. Okay, God always sees more than we do. The two things I see in this passage that just jump out to me. The first one is the way in which God, through the angel of the Lord, addresses Gideon. Gideon is just like everybody else. He's in a place of fear. He's in a place of stress. He's in a place of distress. He's in a place of struggle. And he is hiding right now he's just trying to get some wheat for his family, for his tribe, for his city. He's just trying to do this before he gets seen, before he gets captured, before he gets killed, and before the stuff he's working on is gone. He's living and responding in his life to a place of fear. And the last thing in the world he's going to identify with is, "Hey, you, mighty hero. The Lord's with you." But God has a way sometimes, especially in this story, of calling out what is actually in you versus what you see in your circumstances. He has a way of understanding your true identity and speaking that true identity over you to help you understand that there's actually something more to your life than just the circumstances that you see. Because that's the second thing I pull out from this, is that Gideon's very much like us. When bad times come, all we can see are the bad times. All we can see is when circumstances don't go our way, when things are not functioning, when things are not working, all we can see is what's wrong. And we focus in on that, and we assume that God doesn't see it, and we assume that God doesn't care, and we assume that we're alone. And yet God always sees more than we do. Always sees more than we do. And so you respond. You respond in such a way, "Hey, God, if this is the case, then why is everything wrong? Why is everything, why is everything bad?" And it goes on to say this. He goes on to say, "Where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." And the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least of my entire family." And the Lord said to him, "I'll be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." I really do believe that God, He affirms our courage with His presence. It's just another piece of this pie. I'll be honest, I've probably taught on Gideon at least maybe almost a dozen times through Bible studies and sermons and things. And it's one of my favorite stories. To be honest, if you were to ask me one of my favorite characters of the Old Testament, I would say Gideon. I love the way, and we'll read it a little bit later on, how he tests God and just the nature of that. And I've probably learned more in terms of just understanding this life of fear and moving that to a life of faith from Gideon's story. I resonate a lot with Gideon's story. But the reality is that just in the last 2 weeks, these verses just popped out to me. It was just a fresh awakening for me as I read these verses. I don't know why. Maybe I just don't remember them sticking out to me before. But I just, as I read those words, look, go in the strength that you have. I really felt convicted that many, many times, I believe sometimes, even as Christians, we sort of hide behind what we claim that we want God to do. And the reality is that He's already given us the strength to take steps to accomplish it. We rely on God to kind of go in and do it for us, and He never said He'd do it for us. He said He would be what? With us, right? So as I read that, it just came as a new awakening for me. I just was like, oh my gosh, I don't understand this, because if you just took these verses, it could be very kind of self-helpy, and it could be very much like a Nike commercial, like you can do it, that kind of thing. And the reality is that's not what it's saying. That's not what it's saying. He is saying to Gideon, I have, as your creator, I have already given you the power to step forward and accomplish all that I've called you out to be and to do. Mighty hero. I've already given you that power. And then he starts with the excuses, right? The excuses. Man, me and my group of friends, we're like the geeks. We're like the losers. We're like the lowest in terms of the whole tribe. We're the ones that if anybody was going to be left out, it would be my group of friends, my clan, my circle. And out of them, I am even the least of my family. So we start giving excuses back to God as to why that doesn't make any sense at all. And he says, not he doesn't say, I'm not going to do it for you. He says, I will be with you. And he goes back to using the words, you're going to fight them. You're going to win the victory. You are going to do this as easily as if it was just you and one other man. These hordes of the enemy that they've been dealing with and living in fear of. He says, you're going to have victory. I'll be with you. You're going to have it. Because that's in you. And I love the fact that really the power within us to move from that place of fear to faith, that power within us is to have the courage to take a step forward. The courage to follow God. The courage to overcome the fear that's constantly tripping us up. The fear, anxiety, the worry, the stress. And actually take a step and follow and trust God alone. That's what we have, that ability. You guys, I'm telling you, you have made yourself do things before you never thought was possible. You have that power within you. God has given you the power to have courage over your fear. It does not mean your fear goes away. But you have that within you. You can't accomplish all God wants you to do without him. He didn't want you to do that. He didn't say that. He says, no, I want you to take a step. You have that power to do that. I'm going to be with you. And I'm going to accomplish this through you. We're not called to do the incredible thing that God's called us to do. We're just called to have courage to show up and let him do it through us. But it still takes us taking that step. As we continue with this story, Gideon has a moment where he offers a sacrifice back to God. And he goes on to offer this sacrifice, and God does another miracle in his presence just to show him that it is God. And then he comes back to Gideon, and he says, that night, the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old. I like the detail that God gave there, right? Pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. There's an altar to Baal, and Asherah is very similar in terms of just the unity of Baal in terms of pagan gods. Asherah pole was the representation, and the altar was for sacrifice. Cut it down. He says, then build an altar to the Lord your God here on the hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using the fuel of the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down. Which I love that, right? Use the pole you just cut down, there's your firewood. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had commanded, but he did it, when did he do it? At night, because he was what? Afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of town. Don't miss that, right? Don't miss the fact that, again, the courage to take your step forward, the courage to step into following God does not mean that fear goes away. It doesn't mean fear goes away. It just means that you have the power to overcome it and trust him and him alone. And so he still obeyed. He still did exactly what God told him to do, even though he was still in fear. We pull this out because this is a big deal for Gideon and even for us, that private faithfulness is often a prerequisite for public usefulness. Now, this probably goes more into leadership, but I believe it just has to do with all of us in terms of following. That sometimes God has maybe spoken an identity over you in terms of what he feels like, you feel like he wants you to do with your life, the direction he wants you to go, what he wants you to do, what plan he has for you, already laid out for you to accomplish. If you would simply surrender and have courage over your fear and stress and worry and anxiety and follow him and trust him alone. The reality is that sometimes he can't do it. He's not going to live and work in you in power until you get rid of some of the junk in your home. And that home may not be physical home. It might be this home. Now, what did Gideon have to deal with? He had to deal with the altars. The altars, he had to deal with idols, He had to deal with idols. And part of that is I want you to see, what is an idol? Well, an idol is simply whatever we would sacrifice for and whatever we put our trust in. our faith in, above and beyond God. So whatever we would sacrifice for, whatever we would trust in, and if you don't know what the idols are in your life, a really good marker is to follow the path as to why you're so stressed and why you're so fearful and why you're so worried and why you're so anxious, and you will see the idol in your life, or idols. Okay, because money can be an idol, financial security can be an idol. Your home can be an idol. The control you desire to have in your life can be an idol. Your family can be, your kids and your family can be an idol. Your job and career can be an idol. Your relationships can be idols. It's whatever it is that you're sacrificing for or you're putting your trust in, some of those things may have to go. You may have to deal with that before God's actually going to work in power through you to push you and move you towards what he's called on you and of you to do. That private faithfulness, that dealing with you first is a prerequisite for God to use you publicly. I said this a couple weeks ago that quite frankly, your talents, right? Your talents and abilities will give you far more opportunities that if you're not careful, your character will not sustain it. Which is why this is necessary. As we keep moving on in this story, this is a place in which I think oftentimes is misunderstood. The Gideon said to God, this is after he's already obeyed, and the town folk, had a big argument as to what happened with the altar and what happened, and his dad kind of stood up for him, even though he was pretty scared of what his dad's response was going to be. Gideon gets ready with his army, and he says to God, are you truly going to use me? If you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel, as you promised, prove it to me this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. And the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry. Then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised. And that is just what happened when Gideon got up early next morning. He squeezed out the fleece and wrung out a whole bowlful of water. And when Gideon said to God, I love this way he responds. This is what my kid says to me sometimes. Please don't be angry with me. But let me ask you for one more request. Let me use the fleece one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while on the ground around it is wet with dew. And so that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew. Now, I want you to be very careful about this because, again, this is one of the things I studied for a while. This is very misread, misused, misinterpreted often is this story of testing. Because God tells us in the Old Testament and in the Bible, don't test me. He means, do not test me for who I am. Don't do it. Matter of fact, bad things happen when people did it. So why did anything bad happen to Gideon? I'll tell you why. There is a difference, okay? There is a difference between testing God in your obedience versus testing God for obedience or to be obedient. There's a difference. And when we have this story misinterpreted, we come up with really bad theology. We come up with things like, I'm just waiting for God to show me a sign, right? Just God, show me a sign, which in your mind, like you're looking for your husband, and you think there's going to be a holy shaft of light that shines down on this person, and he's going to glitter like the Twilight movies, like the sparkly, face and stuff. Like you're going to know, right? God's going to give me a sign I'm going to know. Or bad theology that says, well, if God does this, then I'll do that. Like if he just makes this happen, then I'll go forward and do this, as if we have some sort of tit-for-tat relationship with our Creator. Or sometimes people view the absence of a sign as a sign. Well, he didn't really stop this from happening, so I guess this is it. He didn't really remove this option from the table, so I guess it's still a good option for me to have. He didn't really do anything with this, and so I guess it's time for me to step forward and do something about it. And we think that's how God is leading us. And again, these are the things that kind of create bad practice, bad methodology, bad theology in terms of how we view and understand God. Gideon in this moment has already gathered his army. He has already done the work. He is already pressing forward. He's at the edge of the cliff and he's going to jump off. And he asks God for clarity, which is not a sin. He asks God for wisdom and clarity, and he does it in his obedience, leaning forward. He doesn't pull back and go, well, could you do this for me? Because I'm just not sure. And if you do it, well, then I'm going to obey. And here's the tricky part. The only one that's going to know that is you and God. Okay, he knows your heart. He knows whether your heart is committed to following him no matter what the cost. He knows whether your heart is committed to moving forward in obedience no matter what the outcome may be when you ask for that test, when you ask that clarification. The New Testament actually tells us to test the spirits. Test the spirits that are maybe kind of speaking into your life. And the problem is, if you don't know that discerning voice of God, you have to test some things, right? Because I got like 7 voices going on in here. Somebody speaks Spanish. I got an angry French man. Like, those things happen. And so you have to sometimes test things to say, I understand, God, you're talking to me, but I got a lot of other voices too. So I test some of those things, and that's what he means by testing the spirits, so that I can discern which one is God speaking to me to say, go forward. And that's okay, because that's forward in obedience, not testing it whether or not I'm going to actually do it or not, whether I'm going to shrink back in fear or actually do what God's called me to do. There's a difference. And we see that here in Gideon. Let me keep moving, keep trucking. We have, I'm lost here. Okay, testing. There we go. We're going into chapter 7. Now that that's happened, now that he's done that and gotten clarification, and God's done it twice, it says Jerubbaal, which is a new name that was given to Gideon because he was the first one to defy Baal, so they gave him kind of a new name like the one who tore down Baal. His army got up early and went as far as the spring of Harod. The armies of Midian were camped in the north of them in the valley near the hill of Moriah. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. If I let you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore, tell the people, hey, whoever's timid or afraid, you may leave the mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, there are still too many. Bring them down to the stream, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. Then Gideon took his warriors down to the water. The Lord told him, divide the men into 2 groups. In one group, put those who cup the water with their hands and lap it up with their tongues like a dog. In the other group, put those who kneel down and drink out of their mouths from the stream. Only, what's the number? One more time, only of the men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. Then the Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. Now, I don't know about you, but I would not have done very well in Gideon's spot, right? And here's the reason why, and here's the last principle we're going to pull from this story. Here's the big principle. Success is determined by God's power, not our perceived power, not our perceived strength. Now, here's the problem, especially when this is hard. I'll let you know this. It is much easier to see this in your life in hindsight. It's much easier to see this in the past than it is to be really tuned in the moment. You know, at that time when he says, just tell everybody who doesn't want to fight to go home if they're afraid. Hey, guys, what's this? And 22,000. I can't imagine what Gideon was thinking. Okay, Lord, I was figuring 10% maybe, right? 15, 20%. Like there was an acceptable margin of loss that I was okay with, okay? 2/3 of these guys go home. And as he's separating the people with the 300 and the 9,700, he's probably going, yeah, that's still pretty good. That's right there. Oh, wait, what? That one? You mean that one? So here's what we learn. For you and I, and we just know this. This is not brand new. We know this. It's very hard when God starts to strip away what you perceive are the strengths that are going to help you accomplish what he's asked you to do. It's very hard for us. When they got started to get stripped away because I thought it was going to be that job. I thought it was going to be that margin of money. I thought it was going to be that connection and that relationship and that opportunity because, I felt the sense to go forward and do this, and I've been leaning in and obeying, and I was leaning on those things without even really knowing it to accomplish what you called me to do, and now you've pulled them away. God, are you paying attention? Isn't that what we say? God, do you know what you're doing? Because we don't always get the precursor of the conversation, right? There's too many. No, we don't usually get that. We usually see it afterwards. We usually see it when he pulls it away and sees whether or not we're going to shrink back in fear or if we're going to continue to have courage to press forward. And what's worse, what's really hard, is when you absolutely are walking tightly and closely with God and he actually tells you to release some things. Release that relationship. Release that job. Release these things. Release those things. You don't need them to accomplish what I've called you to do. And we are just like, but I might, right? Like in that moment, like, ugh, I might. Are you really sure? Like, where's my fleece? You know, the whole time, like, is this the moment, right? We have to remember that success, fulfillment, the understanding to live out the fullness, the unlimited potential that God sees in all of us, if we follow him, we're going to experience that only by his power, only by his strength, and only by him showing up, not our perceived strength. Why? Because if we were able to accomplish it with everything that we kind of arranged and figured out how to accomplish it, then we're going to trust in us. The next time that comes around, we're going to be like, I can handle this. I totally handled it last time. Just move some of this money here, figure that out, make those 2 calls, right? We trust in our ability. We trust in our perceived strength rather than trusting in God's power and strength alone. So sometimes those things have to be removed. Now, I know it's a cliffhanger, but I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story, all right? There's a phenomenal battle. God does some amazing things. There's some more testing, or actually some opportunity to test. There's some great things. I mean, Gideon goes on to lead for another 40 years. He goes on to bring peace to them for 40 years. They love Gideon so much. He becomes this fearful least of his family to really a general, a fearless general who hunts the Midianites down till they're all gone and pushed away. And they want to make him a king, and he says no. And he properly gives God the credit. He properly moves himself into places in his family, into places where they understand that God is the one that we should be following. So go read the story for yourself. I want to end it here because I want you to hear this above and beyond anything else, especially when it comes to us in terms of following God. I want you to hear this, that the strength is in you to be the leader and follower God is calling you to be. If you don't hear anything else, I want you to hear that. That the strength is already in you to be exactly who he's called you to be. I don't know if you've ever heard him speak your true identity over you or not. I don't know if you're in that place in your life and in your walk. I don't know if he's already given that or he's called someone else to speak that into you and you have continued to live your life by fear. And you do not step into those things that you feel like God's called you to or that other people have kind of witnessed in your life and spoken into you because they see it in you. You don't do it because you're just afraid. You're worried, you're stressed, you're filled with anxiety, your life is too busy. There's so many excuses to give back to God why we won't simply step forward. But the strength is already there. It's already in you. And here's the reason I know this. This is our closing verse. I'm going to read it first, and then I want you guys to read it with me. It's from Ephesians. And it says this. For we are his workmanship. And we're his workmanship. He's put time and effort and care into creating you. Created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Let's read it all together, out loud. Ready? For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Just leave that verse up for me. I just want you to hear this from me. Because I have a message for just some very specific ones of you this morning. This is not a you can do it message. Apart from Christ, I can do nothing. But it's very clear as I read scriptures, I see this as it kind of comes alive in me that I have too many times in my life taken a back seat and asked God to step first when he has said, no, I already gave you the strength. I created you with the strength to take the first step, and I promise you I'm going to affirm that and meet you there. When you take a step in obedience to follow only me. It's that step of faith. It's that step of confidence that not only has he called you, but he's given you the strength to take that step. So I don't normally do this. This is just one of those special days because of the nature of the message. But I'm going to ask you this morning. I don't remember who raised their hand, but I'm going to ask you this morning. If you want to see a change in your life, not just the past, but you currently know you are experiencing way more fear and way more stress and way more anxiety than you should be feeling as a follower of Christ, and you can tell that it affects your life, and that life is yours. You want to follow God. You want to see this change happen. If that's you and you're serious about it, I want you to stand up right now. Stand up. You want to see this change. Here's the message I feel like God gave me to give you in the midst of even looking at Gideon and just coming alive with the story and then the verse in Ephesians. Let me just reiterate to you. You do not need to wait on God. You don't need to wait on God to have the courage to overcome your fear, to have the courage to overcome your anxiety, to have the courage to take a step forward and say, I'm going to tear down the altars that I've already built and follow you and trust you alone. That strength is already in you. And listen, when you respond back with your fear, when you respond back with your excuses, I want you to understand, you are a workmanship of God. He created you on purpose, with purpose. You are not the least of your friends when it comes to your talent and your passion and your ability. You're not the least of your family. You are not a mistake. You are created with a purpose in mind before you were born. People don't like that word destiny, and Christians don't like that word. It's got too much weird Eastern crap with it. I understand, but I'm telling you, He has predestined a walk in your life. He has given you a name. He has called you by name. And if you don't know what that identity is, you can rest on the fact that you are a son and daughter of the Creator. That's who you are. Regardless of what you think, regardless of what you feel, regardless of what the enemy whispers in your ear, you are His and He loves you. And He wants you to take the courage to take steps forward in following Him. You do not have to think about what you're going to accomplish because He said He would be with you. You do not have to live. You do not have to settle for this fear and anxiety and stress in your life. You can give it to Him. And it doesn't mean that the things that cause stress, and it doesn't mean that the things that cause fear are going to leave your life. It doesn't mean they're going to be absent. It just simply means they are not going to be as present as the courage you have in trusting and believing in God. They'll still be present, but they will begin to be drowned out. That power is already there. It's up to you to make the decision, to have the courage, to take a step forward. It's been in you this whole time. And a week from now, and a month from now, and a year from now, when circumstances are not where they should be, and you want to, and everything in you to take a step back, I am urging you, keep pressing forward. And put your faith in the one who can cast out your fear. Your courage is necessary. You have to exercise it. But He has something prepared for you if you would only walk in it. Would the rest of you guys stand? Would the rest of you stand? I want you guys to help me and just pray for those who stood up, all right? And some of them are introverts, so don't like touch them or anything. That makes this a very bad moment, like we said earlier. Just pray with me for them and with them this morning. Let's pray together. Father God, I am so thankful for those in our first service and those now that had the courage to stand and say they wanted a change. They did not want to settle anymore for the stress and the fear and the anxiety and the worry that consumes their life. God, I pray that you would help them, even this morning, understand that the power, the strength is already in them to have courage, to overcome that fear. And that, God, if they would simply take that step, if they would move to you, surrendering everything else and to you alone, that God, your promise is true. You would and will be with us to accomplish in us the unlimited, unmeasurable, unstoppable things that you have planned in our lives. God, I'm so glad as we sang that song today, I am so happy that we are no longer a slave to our fear. That those that without you, those that do not know you, those that don't experience you every day, have no choice but to live in fear. But for those who call you Father, God, we are not slave anymore. We can overcome it. And we can come to you. And you can help us move even further past it as we follow and trust you alone. God, I'm so thankful today. Please continue the work that you've done this morning through your word, through your Spirit, in everyone's life here this morning as a wonderful reminder that we're all followers of you. Some of us have been given clear leadership roles. Some of us have been called a leader. You have spoken that over us, and it has yet to come to fruition because we have not taken the steps you want us to take. God, I'm praying that for all of those that you're calling up, that they would have the courage to take a step in the right direction in you. Thank you this morning, God, for your incredible word and the way in which you and your powerful Spirit moves through it and through us as we read it. In your name, Jesus, amen.